Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into something pretty fascinating? We're going to explore the history of oil.
Yeah, it's a story full of crazy twists, huge personalities, and global power struggles. We're going to see how oil, this thing we kind of take for granted, has really shaped the whole world.
And our guide for this journey, we're cracking open the prize, the epic quest for oil, money, and power, the Pulitzer Prize winner by Daniel Yergin.
Yergin's not just some historian, though. He's a top energy expert, so he really gets all the forces at play here.
So he's not only telling us what happened, but why it matters, which is huge. I think most of us, myself included, don't think much about oil. Gas tank, heating, that plastic thingamajig. But where did it all begin?
Exactly. Easy to forget, oil wasn't always the energy king. We're going way back, before cars, planes, even decent lamps, to see where this global commodity came from.
So basics, what was oil even for before all this modern stuff?
Well, before gasoline, the main thing was kerosene.
Kerosene, like old lamp stuff.
You got it. Picture a world lit by candles, maybe whale oil, pricey, stinky, and fire hazards galore. Kerosene was cheaper, brighter, safer. A total game changer.
It's wild how what's old-fashioned now was once revolutionary. Who were the folks who figured out this rock oil, as they called it?
Key guy early on was a Yale professor, Benjamin Silliman Jr. Back in the 1850s, he got a sample, analyzed it, and bam, saw its potential as an illuminant.
So one professor kicks off the kerosene craze.
He set the stage, but getting it to everyone was a whole other thing. Yergin talks about how these early pioneers had to figure out how to even find oil reliably, how to get it out efficiently, and then how to make a lamp that could actually burn kerosene, right?
I bet that was a lot of trial and error. And some interesting characters along the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most famous is Colonel Edwin Drake.
Colonel?
Not a real colonel, by the way, but he's known as the guy who drilled the first commercial oil, well, Pennsylvania, 1859.
So he's the one who got the oil boom going.
Often credited with it, yep. And Yergin describes this Pennsylvania rush pure frenzy. Land speculation everywhere, people getting rich and losing it all overnight, towns popping up around oil fields, then abandoned just as fast when the wells went dry.
It's like the Wild West, but with oil derricks instead of saloons?
Spot on. Huge risk, huge reward. Drew in all kinds. Businessmen, wildcat drillers, all hoping to strike it rich.
And somewhere in this chaos, John D. Rockefeller shows up, right?
He does, and Yergin's take on him is fascinating. Not just a ruthless tycoon, but this brilliant strategist who saw potential in all the chaos and wanted to, organize it. He knew oil wasn't just about luck, you needed control.
And control he got. Standard Oil became, well, legendary.
Totally. Rockefeller changed the game with this thing called vertical integration. He wasn't just producing oil, he controlled almost everything. Refining, transporting, marketing, the whole 9 yards. Even cut deals with railroads for better rates, squeezing out rivals.
That's where the ruthlessness comes in.
Yergin doesn't shy away from Rockefeller's tactics. Aggressive, relentless, using his power to take down competitors.
So it wasn't just finding oil, it was making deals, building stuff, and outsmarting everyone else.
You got it. Rockefeller wasn't just about oil, he was about the whole system.
Right.
Master of what we'd call supply chain today, making sure his oil flowed from well to customer, with him profiting every step of the way.
So he built an oil empire, and he wouldn't even try to challenge him.
Oh, yeah. And this is where we see oil going global, big time.
Who else enters the scene?
Late 19th century, competition pops up from a surprising place, Russia.
Russia, I thought they were known for, winters and vodka, not oil.
Well, they had tons of untapped oil in the Caucasus. Powerful people saw the potential. The Rothschilds, the big European banking family, invested heavily. They figured they could take on Standard Oil.
American oil baron versus European banking giants. Things are getting interesting.
Clash of Titans, showing how oil was already this worldwide thing, with international players battling for control.
But it wasn't just them, right? You mentioned another guy, Marcus Samuel.
Yes. Samuel's story is wild. Jewish entrepreneur from London's East End, he saw something both Rockefeller and the Rothschilds missed.
What was that?
Transportation. Back then, oil was moved in barrels, slow, expensive. Samuel's idea. Bulk transport using tankers.
Tankers, like huge ships full of oil.
Bingo. He built a whole fleet of modern tankers, revolutionized how oil moved around. This let him beat Standard Oil's prices and go global.
Basically, a floating oil pipeline.
You could say that. His company, Shell Transport and Trading, became a major player, challenging Standard Oil and the Russians.
So we've got Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, now Samuel. A three-way battle for oil supremacy. This is getting intense.
Yeah.
But something's missing here. Where do cars fit in? We've got lamps, tankers, but no automobiles yet.
That's where things really take off. The internal combustion engine and then cars becoming popular totally changed the game for oil.
I can imagine. Suddenly, everyone wants a car, which means they need gas. A whole new market explodes.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for the oil-soaked world we know. From gas stations everywhere to international fights over oil fields, the 20th century is the age of oil.
Wow, so in just a few decades, we go from kerosene lamps to a global scramble for this black gold. It's crazy how fast this industry changed and how much it's a part of our lives. But I think we need a minute to absorb all this. We've gone from muddy Pennsylvania fields to global finance boardrooms.
You're right, and we've just scratched the surface. We'll be back to dig into the 20th century and how oil shaped global politics, economics, even war.
Back again, digging deeper into the world of oil. Before we went away, we were talking about cars taking over and how that totally changed how much oil people needed.
It's hard to overstate how much the car changed things for oil. Yergin really makes it vivid with all of these details. Like, did you know the first drive-in gas station wasn't a thing until 1907?
Really, I always picture those old pumps outside a general store, like something from an old Western.
That was the early way, yeah. But more and more cars meant they needed a quicker way to fuel up, you know?
Makes sense. The drive-in was born. Funny how things we don't even think about were once big innovations.
It shows how oil's not just about the tech, but our everyday lives too. Speaking of which, this time period also sees some familiar names popping up in the oil world.
You mean like Shell and the other big ones we know today?
Right. Companies like Shell, which we talked about, and others like Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later became Exxon, they were all trying to be the top dog as everyone wanted gasoline.
So competition's heating up, and I bet the stakes were getting higher too.
For sure. The hunt for oil wasn't just about Pennsylvania or even the U.S. anymore. Oil fields were being found in places like Texas, Venezuela, and the Middle East, which made those areas super important for energy globally.
And this is when oil gets really mixed up with global politics, right?
You got it. Yergin goes deep into how oil shaped 20th century politics. He says controlling oil became this huge factor in how countries got along, who they sided with, even wars.
Makes me think of World War I, which I know is all about getting access to oil.
World War I was a game changer. Yergin shows how the Allies having oil, especially from the U.S., helped them win.
And I imagine Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers, really felt the lack of that oil, huh?
Big time. Not enough oil messed up their war effort. Showed how risky it was to rely on someone else for something that important.
So it wasn't just about armies or weapons, it was about having the fuel to keep them going.
Exactly. And everyone realized that, which changed how countries thought about energy. Like, we got to be sure we've got enough.
It's like they were playing chess, but the oil fields were the most important spots on the board.
Great way to put it. And this global chess game got even more complicated after World War I, with oil nationalism popping up in countries that produced oil.
Oil nationalism, huh? Sounds serious. What does that even mean?
Basically, countries with oil said, hey, this is ours, we're in charge. They realized oil was valuable and didn't want to just be suppliers for foreign companies.
So it's like they finally said, this oil is ours and we're calling the shots.
Exactly. They wanted more of the money and more control over how much oil they produce and the price. This is what led to OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, starting in 1960.
OPEC. Everyone knows them, especially after the 1970s. But back then, they were the new kids on the block. What were they aiming for?
OPEC wanted to get all the oil-producing countries, mainly in the Middle East and Africa, to work together on oil policies. That way, they'd have more power when talking to the big oil companies.
Like a union for oil countries, standing up to the big guys.
You could see it that way. And their influence got real clear in the 1970s with, well, some stuff that really shook things up.
You're talking about the oil shocks, right? Lines at gas stations, prices going crazy. I remember my folks talking about it.
The 1970s oil shocks were huge for oil history. First one, 1973, was caused by the Arab oil embargo because of the Yom Kippur War.
So oil became a weapon, not just about economics, but using it to get what they wanted politically.
Exactly. That embargo made oil prices jump like 4 times higher. Total chaos for industrialized countries. Rationing, inflation, people not knowing what was going to happen next.
Must have been a wake-up call for any country relying on someone else for oil.
It was. Showed OPEC could really mess with the global economy. But that wasn't the end. A few years later, 1979, another crisis hit.
What was it this time?
The Iranian Revolution. That whole upheaval stopped oil coming from a big producer, prices spiked again, more economic turmoil.
So two big political events, both sending oil prices through the roof. No wonder OPEC became a major player after that.
Yep. And Yergin says these oil shocks weren't just one-off things. They showed a bigger shift in power from those who used oil to those who had it.
So the days of cheap, easy oil were over.
In a way, yeah. The world was different. Oil wasn't just something you bought and sold. It was strategic, something that could change global politics and economics.
This is all super interesting, but we've only gotten to the mid-20th century. Still got decades to unpack, including what happened after those oil shocks, and new things like climate change coming into the picture.
Right. The oil story's far from over. In our last part, we'll look at how the industry adapted to all that and what might be next for this powerful but kind of controversial commodity. Stick around.
And we're back, wrapping up our deep dive into the world of oil. Before, we were talking about the 70s, those oil shocks, and how that totally changed the energy game.
Yeah, the 70s were a big turning point, showed just how vulnerable the developed world was, relying on other countries for oil, and how OPEC could really flex its muscle using oil to get what they wanted politically and economically.
It's wild how something so normal, like filling up your car, is tied to all that global power stuff. So how did everyone adapt, the oil folks, the world in general, to this new reality?
Well, the 80s were kind of crazy for oil booms and busts all over. Remember we talked about Texas in the 30s trying to control production to keep prices steady?
Yeah, they didn't want those huge swings in supply and demand messing up the whole market.
Right. So in the 80s, Saudi Arabia basically took on that role, becoming what's called the swing producer for OPEC.
Swing producer. That's a new one.
Basically, they could produce enough oil to make global prices go up or down just by changing how much they pumped out. Tried to keep things stable, but it's tricky, and by the mid-80s, things went south.
What happened? Did OPEC lose control?
Not quite. Other OPEC members, needing money, started pumping more oil than they were supposed to. Market flooded, prices crashed.
So OPEC kind of sabotaged their own plan.
You could say that led to the big oil price crash in '86. Bad news for the industry, and the global economy felt it too.
Sounds like oil just can't avoid these boom and bust cycles.
True. Oil's history is full of them. But the interesting thing is, even crises can lead to, new ideas. That '86 crash forced the industry to get more efficient. New tech, new strategies for finding, producing, refining oil, the whole shebang.
Had to get lean and mean to survive.
Yep.
But while all that was happening, something else was growing. Environmentalism.
Ah, right. People realizing climate change was real, that fossil fuels had a downside.
Exactly. Put pressure on governments, companies, everyone to find other energy sources. Added a whole new layer to the oil debate.
So oil's time at the top was coming to an end.
Kind of, yeah. But it stayed, and still is, the big fuel source, especially for transportation. Hard to picture a world without cars, planes, trucks. Not yet, anyway.
And as we get to the 21st century, I'm guessing oil and global politics are even more tangled up.
For sure. Yergin shows how oil's still shaping events, from the Gulf War back in the 90s to all the stuff going on in the Middle East now. Who controls the oil? Still a big deal for who holds the power.
It's kind of mind-blowing how this simple, flammable liquid has changed so much of human history.
It shows how energy is about more than just fuel. It's power, progress, the choices we make for the future. And as we try to move to new energy, what we learn from oil's story will be super important. Sounds like oil's story isn't finished yet. We've seen it go from this weird thing to something the whole world relies on. And now, new challenges. Climate change, needing sustainable energy. That's a whole other chapter.
Right. The hunt for oil has been about ambition, innovation, conflict, all of it. And going forward, it's on us to figure out what role we play in making a better, fairer energy future.
Well, I gotta say, this deep dive has been really eye-opening. Learned so much about oil and how it affects everything. Thanks for taking us through it.
My pleasure. Always love exploring how energy shapes the world and our lives.
And to our listeners, thanks for being here. We hope you found this deep dive into oil informative and got you thinking. If you want to learn more, check out the links in our show notes. See you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.